Aston Martin's best form feels like a distant memory, and its decline through 2023 means it's heading towards an underwhelming conclusion peppered with hints of tension. The result is that a lofty dream of beating Mercedes and Ferrari in the championship is as good as dead, and thanks to a shocking contrast in fortune between Aston Martin and McLaren, Fernando Alonso's team is more likely to lose a position in the championship than gain one. Based on the pecking order at several races either side of Alonso's second place at Zandvoort, it looks like his and Aston Martin's most recent podium of the season was more down to some of the two-time world champions' magic and others underachieving than it was to Aston Martin re-establishing itself as the leading contender it was at the start of the year. Though a difficult Monza weekend was anticipated, Singapore did not meet Alonso's high expectations, and Aston Martin was nowhere near the leading teams in qualifying in Japan. Answering why isn't easy, as there's been all sorts of theories around Aston Martin's drop-off this year. Has it been impacted by some flexi-wing clampdowns, for example? The team has been reluctant to answer specific questions on that subject, although it points out its car has always been run in a legal state on any given weekend. And there was the Alonso theory about the change of tyre construction around Silverstone too. The simplest explanation seems to be that Aston Martin just hasn't been able to keep developing its car in the right way and has been outshone by others who have done a better job. Team boss Mike Crack has admitted that upgrades haven't worked as well as hoped, and Alonso reckons it proves how much the team still needs to grow up. Clearly other teams had a lot more low-hanging fruit to grab given their difficult starts to the year, while Aston Martin's AMR 23 had a great foundation after significant progress last winter. Aston Martin personnel keep saying that they feel they've got a good car and they've still got developments coming. Even in Singapore, technical director Dan Fallows insisted they aren't giving up on second in the championship, as the plan is to keep developing the AMR 23 deep into the season. Really, the team should be more worried about losing fourth to McLaren, but we'll come to that shortly. A more generous interpretation of Aston Martin's season is that this is at least 1 year too soon, given its infrastructure deficiencies are only now being resolved with a mid-season move into its new factory and a new wind tunnel in the works. Plus, its recruitment of ace technical minds from other teams meant an amalgamation of existing ideas from elsewhere in creating this year's car, whereas the task of getting those minds to create new ideas from scratch is tougher. And having finished 7th in the championship last year, Aston Martin would have been delighted to be a top 5 constructor that scored 7 podiums in 2023. But the overall trend since the Canadian Grand Prix is disappointing, given the opportunity Aston Martin had this season, and it's a very obvious downward trajectory that means the year risks petering out. That matters because even though Aston Martin will still have plenty to celebrate, the lack of momentum is a problem. The team admits that if you start well but finish poorly, it's much more difficult for morale than if you achieve exactly the same result, but the season plays out the other way around, as we've shown here. Crack says it is very, very important to turn that trend around. But to do that, Aston Martin needs a more competitive car than McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes, and for its second driver to be in regular points contention. Crack ruled out mid-season technical directives relating to flexi-wings having any impact on Aston Martin's form. He also believes the team hasn't fallen away from pace setter Red Bull so much as the others have jumped into the gap that already existed, having had more problems than Aston Martin early in the season. When we look at the bigger picture though, there is a trend of Aston Martin slipping further away, at least on one-lap pace. Not only has that stopped it competing with Ferrari and Mercedes, but by comparison, McLaren's trajectory in terms of performance and points looks much better. After a whirlwind start to the year, Aston Martin is now fighting over scraps in the top 10, whereas McLaren is on the up and now has F1's second fastest car. The contrast in how the first 8 races and the next 8 races have gone for these two teams is stark, and their trajectories are converging, with Aston Martin's advantage in the championship now just 49 points. That's a fairly good margin with 6 races to go, but the problem is McLaren's outscored Aston Martin by more than that in the last 2 weekends alone. After Alonso finished second in Canada, Aston Martin had 154 points. At the same time, McLaren had just 17. Then came McLaren's first really punchy step of the season in Austria in July, led by a new technical structure that team principal Andreas Stella had implemented after 2 races of this year, and then another big upgrade came in Singapore. If you want to learn more about that in detail, check out this video we released earlier this week. 4 podiums and 155 points across the 8 races since the first upgrade has brought McLaren within touching distance of Aston Martin, which has mustered just 67 points in that time. And the points gap that exists now should not intimidate McLaren and should not be of any comfort to Aston Martin. It's not just possible McLaren wins the fight for fourth, it looks likely. As we said earlier, Aston Martin has not thrown in the towel, but the AMR 23 is just not as good as the MCL 60 anymore. And Alonso is scoring points almost on his own, whereas McLaren has two drivers in fine form. Even though Oscar Piastri has been a race behind Lando Norris both times a major upgrade arrived, he's still scored 52 points in the last 8 races. Aston Martin's combined total in that time, as we mentioned earlier, is only 67. The elephant in the room is Lance Stroll. Though he has had moments of rotten luck, like having to retire as a precaution in Japan having got himself into points contention, he has often underperformed in qualifying or caused big problems for himself, like ruling himself out of the Singapore Grand Prix with a big and ultimately avoidable crash in Q1. Stroll's not expected to match Alonso, but he needs to do a lot more than he has this season to justify being in a car as competitive as the Aston Martin. He's not offering enough, and it's really costing the team. F1 is returning to Qatar after a year away, with the high-speed, sweeping Lusail International Circuit set to become a long-term fixture on the calendar from now on. After making its debut as a crucial race in the tense 2021 championship run-in, the Grand Prix took a year off due to Qatar hosting the FIFA World Cup, with this year's race the start of a 10-year deal with F1. The circuit has been closed for part of this year for renovations to its facilities to take place, although this work will not have had a major impact on the layout of the circuit itself, which proved demanding for the drivers and the machinery in 2021. The Grand Prix will mark the reopening of the venue that's hosted major international motorsport for the last 2 decades. 6 weeks later, MotoGP will make its annual visit to the Lusail International Circuit, and in 2024 the venue will become one of the few tracks to ever host F1, MotoGP and the World Endurance Championship in the same season. To get your tickets for this year's F1 race, head to the link on the screen or in the description for this video. When Aston Martin scored podium after podium earlier this year and set up a serious challenge for second in the championship, it looks like a well-sorted, motivated and upwardly mobile team led by its new star signing, and was showing a lot of rivals just how much progress can really be made in a short space of time in F1. But the way the rest of this season has gone for Aston Martin and McLaren in particular creates an interesting extrapolation for the future. McLaren can have great confidence in all its major foundations. Its drivers are excelling, the technical team is working well, upgrades are plentiful and powerful, Andrea Stella's coming into his own as a proactive, compelling team boss. Meanwhile, Aston Martin clearly has a serious driver problem to solve at some point, and its development has not been as impactful as hoped. While it will inevitably take time for Aston Martin's investment in new resources to pay off, McLaren's going through the same thing. And Crack has admitted that infrastructure cannot be used as an excuse because Aston Martin was able to design a very high-performing AMR 23 to start the season. It needs to work out where it's gone wrong, why things haven't worked as well as hoped, and what it needs to change to fix that. Otherwise, there should be serious concerns the 2024 car will still be lacking against rival teams that are fixing the mistakes they made earlier this year. The flip side, of course, is that not so long ago we would have said the exact opposite. So even if Aston Martin loses out to McLaren over the final few races, writing it off longer term would be extremely premature. Momentum is important though. It inspires confidence if you have it, it weighs heavily if you don't. And when a team has a driver like Alonso behind the wheel, stagnation is a very bad thing. In Aston Martin's weakest spell of the season, Alonso has gained attention with some spiky radio messages. He has a best finish of 8th over the last 3 races, and that's the reality of a less competitive car. It creates more frustrating situations and more Alonso radio complaints. In Singapore, he told his team the car was undrivable. In Japan, we heard him declare his team had thrown me to the lions by stopping that early, although Alonso was annoyed by that after the race, calling it the classic FOM radio, completely out of context. There are more than a few people in the F1 paddock interpreting this as a sign of Alonso growing impatient and annoyed at Aston Martin's fall after such a bright start. We know the high standards Alonso strives for, operates to himself and demands of those around him, and Aston Martin's declining form is not meeting them. Alonso's doing a lot to push Aston Martin on at the moment. He's scoring points single-handedly for the most part, he's being proactive over the radio to try to take charge of races, and he continues to grasp almost every opportunity available. But the strength of Alonso's radio messages and the frustration with which he described feeling so impotent on the straights in Japan, for example, may also be interpreted as stressing a clear point of weakness in the car and an annoyance at that. Given the prevailing trends, it would be a surprise if it's the last spike in frustration we hear from Alonso this year. His focus will probably be on the few remaining updates Aston Martin brings and if they offer a chance of ending the year on a relative high. But if there are more weekends like the last few before 2023 ends, and if Aston Martin ends up being beaten by McLaren in the standings, then Alonso's dissatisfaction may well start coming to the surface more often.